Welcome to our discussion on the Naglieri General Ability Tests. I'll be your moderator for this Q&A, and I'm excited to introduce the authors of the Naglieri General Ability Tests, Dr. Jack Naglieri, Dr. Dina Brulles, and Dr. Kimberly Lansdowne. These three separate tests measure general intellectual ability using verbal, nonverbal, and quantitative content. The main goal of these tests is to ensure that identification of all gifted students, regardless of their race, ethnicity, educational opportunities, and language, can gain access to gifted and talented education. In this video, we will have the opportunity to hear from each of the authors. Would you please introduce yourselves? Dr. Naglieri, you can begin.
Thank you, Antonia. Hi, I'm Jack Naglieri. I have been building tests for probably, about 40 years now, and really excited to be able to share ideas about those tests with my two co-authors here today.
Hi, I'm Dina Brulles, and I am the Director of Gifted Education for a fairly large school district in Phoenix, Arizona, Paradise Valley Unified School District. I'm also the Gifted Program Coordinator for the Master's Program in Gifted Education at Arizona State University. And I have been using Dr. Naglieri's test for decades, and we're excited to be here today to talk about some new tests coming out.
Hi, my name is Kim Lansdowne. I am the Executive Director of the Herberger Young Scholars Academy, which is a specialized school located on Arizona State University campus. I am also on the faculty of Mary Lou Fulton Teachers College, and I really specialize in testing and measurement in my teaching. I have extensive experience too with administering all kinds of different cognitive abilities assessments. And so this is just a passion that we all share, is to find those kids, those smart kids that are out there. I'm glad to be here.
Great, thank you all so much for those introductions. So how did everyone get interested in equitable assessment and especially the identification of gifted students?
Dina and I have been professional colleagues for, Dina, over 20 years now, right?
Mm-hmm.
And when we first met, we were on the Arizona Association of Gifted Children, the board for the state of Arizona, and equitable identification was at that point very much talked about and very much an issue more than 2 decades ago. And there have been a lot of people that have put a lot of time and energy and research into this problem, but it still exists. And there have been small changes over the past few decades, but we really can do more. Dina and I traveled together to Washington to attend SANG, Supporting the Emotional Needs of the Gifted conference. And while we were there, we went in to listen to Dr. Jack Naglieri talk about the assessments that he was introducing at that time. And Dina and I started using those in our respective school districts. And so we have known each other for a long time and really been working towards this together.
When I started getting interested in this topic was because I was working as a gifted coordinator in a Title I district and was about 80% Hispanic. And our gifted population was 80% white. And we thought, there's something wrong here. We need to figure out how we can make this more equitable on the identification aspect. So at that time, I started using the NNAT, and I also started cluster grouping these students together. And within 5 or 6 years, those numbers completely reversed, where our gifted population was 80% Hispanic. We didn't identify fewer white students, but we greatly increased our ability to identify by using those tools, training teachers, and our capacity to serve by bringing in students that had high potential. So skip about 10 years, and then I moved to my current school district in Paradise Valley, and I realized that we were doing a really good job identifying and serving white kids. So I started on this whole track again to reverse some of that and to be more inclusive. I also work with districts all over the country by interacting with those folks around the country, the coordinators, I realized we are all dealing with the same issues. But I see a lot of really extraordinary efforts out there, coordinators in certain schools using the different tests, using local norms and building norms, and they're trying to make headway. And I think our work is going to help propel some of that.
In 1979, I went to Arizona, northern Arizona, actually, for Flagstaff to start working as a university professor in school psychology. When I was there, I learned about how the Native American students were being evaluated. And I was very displeased to see my colleagues in psychology administering intelligence tests to Navajo students who didn't have the knowledge of English and is not as much knowledge in general, and getting low scores on that test. And then the psychologist would interpret those scores as if they were valid. And I felt they were totally invalid because the measurement of intelligence was confounded by the knowledge in general and the knowledge of English in particular. So in 1982, I published my first research paper arguing that the WISC did not measure verbal intelligence for Native American Navajos. That was my first of many papers on this topic. I have repeatedly, decade after decade, argued that we need to measure intelligence in a way that calibrates how well a child can think in a way that's not confounded by how much they know. When I published my Naglieri Nonverbal Ability Test, actually first edition of that was called Matrix Analogies Test in 1985. Even then, in 1985, I explicitly said that this kind of a test could fairly identify gifted children because it's not influenced by what they know. It's a reflection of how well the student can think. And over the years, I've published many papers, research papers, that show that the nonverbal method worked. But people said to me, what about the verbal and the quantitative? And that really led me to start to think about how could we make a verbal and quantitative test that would be workable for everyone. And I had the great fortune of having these discussions with Kim and Dina, and we wrote our first book together, and our conversations over the years led us closer and closer to the ability to come up with solutions, which we'll talk about.
So this has clearly been an issue for a very long time that you all have seen. And so what does it mean to achieve equitable identification of gifted students to each of you?
I guess a goal for a lot of the schools is to that their gifted population reflects their student population. It's rarely the case unless we do something differently. And I've noticed over the years that we keep doing the same thing and keep getting the same results, even though we're striving to correct that. And after decades of watching these students take the test, especially our former ELL students, students of diverse cultures, those that live in poverty, that do not have access to resources, materials, experience. They haven't had some of these opportunities to learn that other students that we are doing a great job identifying maybe have had. So when we dissect that, we take it apart and we're like, what is the obstacle here? And a lot of it is just in the directions, in the language that we are using to administer the test, to give the directions, to show the children how they're supposed to proceed through taking these tests. Sometimes they just don't even understand that completely in order to be able to follow those directions. But then when we get to the test items that are laden with a lot of English language, that a lot of the knowledge that Jack was referring to, once again, we've created obstacles in our processes that are keeping these students not out of our programs, but also out of the recognition that they have high ability and they have potential to learn. And those are the kids that concern me the most, those really smart kids who have not acknowledged who haven't had some of those opportunities. So our goal with these tests is to remove some of those barriers that were keeping them from demonstrating some of that potential that they have.
High achievement does not necessarily mean that a student is gifted. In the past, in my position as a school district coordinator, we would very often have kids that are the high achieving kids that are being identified for gifted programs. And then those high achieving kids are really, yes, will they benefit from the gifted program? Yes, they will, but they are not necessarily the kids who need that program and that service. And so for some school districts, my school district, we were identifying students, and our FTE, or employment, who we hired to go into those schools, was based on the number of students that were identified. So our wealthy, high achieving schools would have full-time gifted specialists and full-time services and a lot of resources. And our Title I schools that we were not having a lot of success identifying students had part-time and sometimes not even enough gifted identified students to have any teacher in the building. And so it's the kids that need those kinds of resources are not the students that are receiving them when we are basing employment on the number of kids that are identified. And so that was always such a big issue to me in a school district that had very diverse levels of socioeconomic status. It was always the wealthier schools honestly got wealthier in this identification. But that was something that was really an issue for us in the district that I was in.
When I think about what equity means, everything that Dina and Kim described certainly applies. And I would just add that the key ingredient is the information that we get when we're trying to make a decision, should the student be in a gifted program or not. And that's complicated in and of itself because of the many different components of that decision-making process. But one of the key elements is an ability test that is used. And the simplest explanation of how equity can be detected with a test is if all children, regardless of their gender or their race, their ethnicity, whether they're English language learner or not, whether they've been disadvantaged or not, that they all have an equal opportunity to answer the questions. And we detect that mathematically by looking at the scores that different groups of children obtain. And as I mentioned, on a traditional IQ test, these groups differ. And that's lack of equity. And so what we wanted, and as you'll see, what we achieved were tests that don't yield big differences. And once you have that kind of information, then equity is more feasible, more possible.